All right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name's Danny Barlow, and I'm really delighted to be moderating this session as part of Yale's Philanthropy Conference. This session's entitled Philanthropy in the Arts, Funders' Roles in Advancing Equity and Sustainability in the Field. There's a ton we could get into. An hour will not we will not solve all the problems in the hour, but we're excited to discuss as much as we can during this time, and I'm really excited to dive in. Before we do, though, I just wanted to let everyone know that there's an informal networking session happening after, so you can continue to talk about the topic with other attendees. The link to this session is in the description below, and it'll be posted in the chat at the end of the session. So the link will take you to a different session that's not recorded, and up to 20 people can share their video. So just a little bit of housekeeping, but if you'd like to continue the conversation about this topic, you're welcome to do so after our session. So first, I would love to introduce our wonderful panelists for this conversation. So I'd like to introduce Shonda Miles-McDill and Ben Cameron. Shonda joined the Heinz Endowment in 2017 as the Creativity Strategic Areas Arts and Culture Program Officer after more than a decade of nonprofit executive and arts management experience. She's worked for theater companies across the country, founded Damascus, a collective of artists and administrators, served as Vice President of Programming and Cultivation at the August Wilson Center for African American Culture, and as Director of Public Relations at the Pittsburgh Cultural Trust. Welcome, Shonda. And I also, of course, and I also am welcome to introduce Ben Cameron. Ben serves as the president of the Jerome Foundation and previously served as the president of the Camargo Foundation. Additionally, Ben supervised arts-focused grants programs and initiatives at the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, managed philanthropic programs for Target Stores and the Dayton Hudson Foundation, served as the executive director of Theater Communications Group, and was director of the theater program at the National Endowment for the Arts. Welcome, Ben. Thank you for joining us. And just a little context for myself as to why I'm moderating this conversation today. I currently serve as the director of the Stage Directors and Choreographers Foundation, which is the nonprofit of the Stage Directors and Choreographers Union in New York City. And I have the pleasure of supporting stage directors and choreographers at all phases of their career. And so that is the work that I do right now. So I think that's all the housekeeping, introducing all of us. And I think it is time to jump right on in. So the first question for both of you is just if you could talk a little bit about your work, the work you do at the foundations that you work at, and then also just the focus of what your foundations fund, what they support. And then this is also an opportunity, if there's anything else you'd like to say about yourself by way of introduction for this conversation, I welcome that as well.
All right.
Shonda?
Okay, Ben.
Sure.
So I have the pleasure of working at the Heinz Endowments for nearly 140 years. The Heinz family has been a key business and philanthropic leader in the Pittsburgh and Southwest Pennsylvania region. The endowments, as we know it today, was formed in 2007 when two separate philanthropic organizations, which were the Howard Heinz Endowment and the Vyra L. Heinz Endowment, came together and merged for one individual charitable organization called the Heinz Endowments. The Heinz Endowments is among the 50 largest philanthropic organizations in the United States, distributing approximately $70 million in grants annually. And I would just say we fund in three general areas: creativity, learning, and sustainability. All are considered through a lens of equity. And there's a long-term dedication to ensuring that all the region are treated with dignity, fairness, and respect, and have an equitable opportunity to reach their fullest potential. My work primarily is with artists and organizations. I manage the Advancing Black Arts in Pittsburgh program alongside Celeste Smith, who's at the Pittsburgh Foundation. I also internally have a suite of operating support grants that I manage. I helped to found the first social justice grant making program at Heinz that was cross-programmatic called Just Arts. Do some work with arts and veterans across with some of our teammates in sustainability. The Small Arts Initiative, which also provides grants for organizations $300,000 or less. And I will conclude by saying my main time right now is spent managing the Americans Cultural Treasures Initiative from the Ford Foundation. Pittsburgh is a partner city. The Heinz Endowment has been working on that initiative, and we just distributed $5.4 million to Black-led organizations in Pittsburgh that are considered cultural treasures. So we are continuing to do that work. And I will pause there.
Awesome. Thank you, Shonda. Ben?
Hi, everyone. I'm so surprised you didn't mention that I'm a graduate of the Yale School of Drama and that audiences in New Haven are still trying to forget my performance on the Yale Rep stage in Measure for Measure, where I was the assistant to Christopher Walken and got to escort Franny Conroy on the stage and had 3 lines. Of course, I was definitive. That said, I am currently the president of the Jerome Foundation in St. Paul, Minnesota. We were founded by composer, painter, Yale Music School grad, and Academy Award winning filmmaker Jerome Hill, here's the Oscar, who won the Best Directing Documentary in 1957 for a documentary he did about Albert Schweitzer. Not surprisingly, my job as the president of the foundation is to steward resources that he left to use in the world today. And we've really done that by focusing a purpose of supporting artists at early stages in their professional careers in the state of Minnesota, where Jerome was born, and in the 5 boroughs of New York City, where he spent the bulk of his creative life, ultimately working with Andy Warhol in experimental film. Excuse me. And we do that primarily through a lens that we've identified of 3 core values that inform everything we do. We exist to both support in the field, but also to model the 3 values of diversity, and by that we mean diversity writ large, diversity of race, of culture, of sexual orientation, of aesthetic, of genre, of problem solving. I mean, this is the big read on diversity. We also support risk or innovation. Our artists tend to push at the edge of the art form a little bit because that's what Jerome did. And third and finally, our 3rd value is humility, which for us means as a foundation, we believe artists know more about what they need than we know as philanthropic professionals. And our job is to get them the resources for what they've defined as most important, with as little interference as possible. And for the artists we support, what humility means is our artists tend to see themselves in service either to a larger aesthetic tradition or to a specific community. So we often say if your job or your desire is to go to Hollywood and get a film contract and have a TV series and win an Emmy, God bless, you're just probably not our kind of artist. So it's those values work on both sides of what we try to behave, but also what we try to support. In closing, in terms of what we'll do, I'll say that these values permeation has really been useful for us, especially in recent changes. But currently, we are also involved in the Ford program here in the local chapter, but 86% of the artists that we funded in our last round of fellowships were BIPOC. 66% of the organizations we fund are either BIPOC-led or the projects that we're funding within them have BIPOC leadership. And again, all of our grant making begins with a conscious look at how might our grantees align with our core values. So that's sort of who we are and what we do.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think that context is going to be really helpful for this conversation for where you all are working and kind of what you're bringing to this. Great. So I think I'd love to just dive into the kind of theme, using that as a framework for this conversation about beyond the new normal, right? If that's the theme of this conference, beyond the new normal, I think the first thing we have to identify is what the new normal is. And so I'm curious if you could both talk a little bit about how would you define this new normal? You know, in my mind, I think that for years and years, folks in the philanthropic world have been trying to work towards more equitable practices, right? I don't think that everyone was like, we need equity in June 2020, right? Like, I think I know this. But now it feels like the new normal is something along the lines of, it's like now no longer acceptable to not be vocal and public about the practices that you have in place and what you're going to do in service of progress and equity and greater inclusion in your work. And so, you know, everyone's being told they must do it, whether they thought they were doing it or not. And so that to me kind of feels like what this new normal is, but I'm curious if you all would agree, if it's something different. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, I'll jump in because I knew Ben was going to go like this. I will say that I think, I really think the new normal has more to do with something that I heard on an earlier panel at this very conference, which is how are we going to deal with the wealth and racial inequity in this country? And I think, like, even though it manifests itself in how organizations, foundations are going to manage their processes, I really think what the field is saying, which is putting a demand on philanthropy, is how are we dealing with these larger systemic inequities, and how are you going to reflect that in a really sustainable way through what you do? And I don't know that everybody, I heard what you said, but I don't know that everyone is taking on this mantle. I think some people are speaking the language, but there's a difference between saying the things that need to be done and then actually being able to measure them, as Ben kind of was able to say, these are our percentages, and this is who we're serving and why we're doing what we're doing. And so I think that it's important to know the difference between this new normal, where I feel there's a lot of people saying a lot of things, but I don't know that they're doing as much. And I also think what is frightening to me is not enough has changed following such a national insurrection, a global pandemic, and just in general some unrest in our nation. So I'll pause there because we have a long way to go, but I think the new normal is a lot of talk, and I'm hoping it's going to result in a lot of action.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny when you raise the phrase "the new normal." I just hear that in a slightly different context. When I think about the new normal that we're all experiencing, I think about the larger world in which we're operating, and what's the new normal that's different than what life was like in the biggest sense 10 years ago. And so for me, the new normal really means sort of three things. One is the new normal is a world of ever accelerating speed and urgency. I have a friend who works at a bank, and their motto is, life has never been this fast before, and it will never be this slow again. And I think there's a part of that really resonates, just the tempo at which we live. The second thing I think about the new normal is disruption on a massive scale is increasing at a constant rate. And so this idea of disruption as being a one-off or an occasional is, for me, a new normal that we should expect significant disruption. And maybe that's COVID, maybe that's bird flu, maybe that's climate change, fire and earthquakes, maybe that's social unrest. This idea that our businesses are going to be disrupted should be an expectation, not a surprise. And then the third thing I always think about the new normal is, especially as a generation much younger than I am, but raised through social media and the internet, is emerging into new positions and new age. There's a new expectation of who gets to participate, who gets to weigh in, who gets to have a say, and who gets to craft action. And that's just a different thing than it was for those of us who were raised before. So when I put all that together, that's the new normal context in which a more professed focus on equity has begun to emerge. My concern right now is, and part of the reason that I think about the core values is, I think there's a divide in the field, and I think we need to be really conscious between this, for funders who look at an issue or a cause as a core value or a core purpose versus those who look on it as a strategy for the present. And I've been a funder long enough to know, okay, first it was all about capitalization. Well, then it was all about diversity. Now it's all about arts education. Well, now it's all about racial equity. There's funders are notoriously having ADD. And I think the real question is, how do we anchor ourselves in core purpose that will transcend change of strategy in this larger context of a new normal? I hope that makes some kind of sense in terms of how we think. And so for us, again, our engagement in racial equity preceded some of these recent disruptions, but what often drives us is the questions of, how do we exercise what's unique in a private foundation? How do we exercise our role as stewards in this new normal context? How is it we think about not being, and for us, the big change right now in a new normal is the role of a philanthropist or a philanthropy professional to be a decider and an assessor and an adjudicator, or is the role of a philanthropist to be a facilitator, a listener, and a synthesizer? And depending on which way that you go, you're going to respond in this new normal in a different way. Have I totally gone off the rails, or is this germane to your question? Yeah.
No, you've said a lot of, there's like a lot, I have like 100 questions that could come from that question, but Shonda, I feel like you had something. Did you want to respond to something in there before
I did. One thing I wanted to say that I think will be a theme throughout this conversation is like a new normal for who, right? We're at a philanthropic conference, we're talking to philanthropy, and I think like for people in philanthropy, all the things that have been mentioned are like spot on, clearly things we have to determine. But I think part of this disruption has been not centering ourselves in what's happening. And the reality is for people who've been excluded, it's not a new normal that things are moving fast. It's not a new normal that they aren't included in conversations. It's not a new normal that there's disruption, because there's disruption in their lives every day when they don't have basic needs and they're still trying to put on a full-fledged production. So I think that like, it's always about, it is a new normal for who. And I think if we spend more time thinking about the way in which we as philanthropy have to deal with the new normal, then really refocusing how the people that we are serving, granting to, in relationship with, are dealing with the new normal, it just causes a different kind of conversation. So I think it's very broad, but I think that there's multiple ways at this conversation.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, I think then my question to that is, so, we'll use this as the inciting incident, right? March 2020, COVID hits, right? You have to start adjusting. You're forced to adjust. Disruptions are happening. And ever since then, I think we've had disruptions throughout, right? It has not been easy going. It has not been smooth. And this idea of being, flexible to the folks that you're funding, this idea of, you have to come up against, here's how we've always done our practices, but now you literally can't mail something in because no one's going to be at the office, right? This is like really nitty gritty kind of stuff. But I'm curious in what you're saying, Shonda, in terms of like, how are we in conversation with the folks we are supporting? What does that funding look like? What does that relationship look like? I'm just curious if you can talk to, right? So we've got the new normal. Beyond the new normal, if we've identified these are all the things that we're grappling with, here are all the, we're aware of all the things that need to change. We're aware of kind of the circumstances that we're in. What are some of the steps that y'all took or you're thinking about taking in order to kind of alleviate those or address them? Because it's not an easy thing to acknowledge all of the really big issues that we're dealing with right now and say, so just fix it, right? But how are you starting to kind of tackle some of the things that have come up over, maybe have been around for years, but have, kind of come to the forefront in the last couple of years to get beyond the kind of, word, just the pretty words, right, of we're going to do better.
Right. One thing I'll say really quickly is, Drucker once said, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? And so I think that a lot of philanthropic organizations had a culture of you come to us, right? You need money, you call us, you come to us. I think for sure what shifted, not in my own practice as a program officer, and I think, but in maybe in the field as I see it, and with some of my colleagues, was like they had to call and find out, are you okay? Are you alive? First of all, are you sick? Are you alive? Are you okay? What do you need? And for many people, that's new in philanthropy. We're used to being on the 30th floor. And if you can find a way to get into relationship with us, we may give you some access to the world. But I think that's not how I entered. I was an artist that was funded by many of the programs that I now manage. And so I had real relationships with many of the people in the field already. And it was my practice to always still remain in relationship and not allow that power dynamic. So what I found was an interesting rub for myself was, why wouldn't you already don't know? You haven't been talking to the people. So what do you mean we're not sure what they need? Because we should have been reading their reports and being in touch. So we should kind of know where they are and what they might need. We should have no problem picking up the phone to ask. And maybe it's 30 calls, but is that really going to be the end of the world? And so there was a change. The other rub for me was, it was almost, I'm going to be honest, it could almost be embarrassing that it took this for you to get ACH payments. Right? We should have been already addressing needs without there having to be a national pandemic for you to do wire transfers. So I think that for me, because it would be in service of the
people you're funding. Yeah, I see.
So to the field, it kind of felt like, I think to some, oh, so now you're willing to do this, and then you want to return back to the same practices after this. So you're not going to keep doing some of these things. You want to return back to me doing these lengthy reports, giving you, sending me a paper check. This was only temporary. So I think that for some, I admire the Jerome Foundation when I hear the things that Ben and their team are doing, but I think for some in the field, the foundations did a temporary switch that then surprised the field because they felt like you could have did it all along, and now you're going to go back. Mm-hmm. But so is it really about the virtue and the values that Ben talks about and these core values that you hold to be true? Or is it something else?
Yeah. And I guess I'm curious, Ben, just when you talk about the Jerome Foundation and the work that it does and its core values in this kind of, in these 2 years, I'm curious where your focus has been, as there have been a lot of conversations and focus on equity and art, being artist driven and all of those types of things. So I'm curious what this time was like for you when you think about, and now what, right? Where is your priority?
The thing that was true for us was since I arrived at the foundation, we made a total switch in 2017 from going from staff adjudicated and driven grants to community panel adjudicated grants, where we assembled representatives of the communities to say, these are the programs and the organizations that are most important to us. And we had just made 2-year grant commitments in January of 2020, based on those community meetings, to say to organizations, we're about to go on a 2-year journey with you to support. We were doing a hybrid grant thing at that point in time. We were saying 75% of our money should support this project for artists. The remaining 25% take for Gen Op for what you need, because we want to help build you stronger even while you're doing work for our artists. So 2 months before the lockdown, we had just done that. Within 2 weeks of the lockdown, I mean, this wasn't rocket science. We knew people were afraid. They were in desperate measures. They suddenly were seeing their earned income dried up, and there was a real issue about, are they going to survive or not? So 2 weeks after the lockdown, we contacted all of our organizations we had just made grants to, and we felt that we already had the signal from the community that these were the most important. And we said, we want to assure you, your 2-year grant is good. We're going to convert the whole thing to Gen Op. We're here. You do not need to pick up the phone and call us, because you got enough fires to put out right now without calling us. We believe in you. When you are ready, or when we can be of use to you, call us. We're here waiting, but we're not expecting to be called until the time it serves you to do so. I know that sounds like a weird thing. So instantly that conversion to Gen Op, just because of timing, was an easy thing for us to make. And then as the lockdown continued, we basically said a year in, when we should have opened the new applications, we looked at each other and said, what the hell are we going to even ask them to put in an application? We don't know when they're coming back, what they're going to do, who's going to hire. So we just said, look, we're just going to extend your grant for another 2 years. And what we are going to do in that 2-year period is we because of the markets, we're not going to quite yet tell you how much we're going to renew at, because if the market crashes and we don't over leverage, but we can promise you there's going to be money for 2 more years after that. And we just reaffirmed to people, we're renewing those grants. We're actually increasing your prior amounts by 20%. At the same time, the board said, in addition to those other organizations, what should we and could we be doing for groups that didn't get the money? And that led us to say, we want to consciously go above and beyond our 5% giving floor, to consciously overspend our budget over a 5-year period. And we did say, and frankly, we're going to spend the bulk of that in years 3, 4, and 5, not years 1 and 2, because we know that a lot of this government, the paycheck relief, that's not going to last. And the floor is going to open up in years 3, 4, and 5 before everybody's fixed. So let's hold the bulk of that back. So we're just moving into that right now. But that is the reason that with that additional money, we've gone into the Ford program, for example. We joined the Mosaic. Because we're a staff of 3, we've been dedicating a lot of that money to collaborative efforts to help BIPOC artists and organizations, especially because there's an efficiency at that requesting end to go through a collaborative, and a consistency of message without saying, oh yeah, here's yet another group to apply to with another application and another. So we've tried to expand our reach by emphasizing new collaborative opportunities. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it talks about kind of like hitting on all the things that you've kind of done since March 2020 hit that you feel, was in line with what you do. Yeah.
The other thing we did, though, which is a little unusual because we had just gotten through the grants process, and like most groups, when we had the group panel, we would get to a certain point and the money would run out. And we would say, we just didn't have more money. We could have felt great about funding more people. And so what we also did was we went back to the groups that were, to be, as an example, we would get probably 70 or 80 groups in a discipline applying for money. And we'd go through a preliminary process with the panel, and the panel would say, these are the 20 or 25 we need to really talk about. These are the ones. We went back to the larger list of 20 or 25 beyond those that got the grants. And we said, even though you didn't get a full grant, we're going to give you a grant now because you were a finalist or you were an alternate. So we're going to give you money at a smaller level, but other people are getting an average of 25 or 30. You're going to get more like an average of 20, but you don't have to apply. We're just going to do that. And we just extended those grants as well. So we amplified our funding base by going deeper into the community discussion pool in addition to launching the collaboratives. Again, no additional applications, no additional reporting note. We just went to the organization and said, this is going to happen. We already have your paperwork in-house. The checks are going to come, just sign the contract.
Yeah. That's great. That's great. And really interesting to kind of hear about all the kind of pivots and adjustments that you made that felt in service of kind of what the moment needed. And, I think one of the things that I'm really curious, you said a little bit about it, and I'd love to hear what you both think about this, but in this time, I know many organizations have created programs specifically for BIPOC artists, right? There's we want to be really specific, in the most generous version, we want to be really specific in who we're supporting and lifting up. So we're going to make sure this program is specifically for BIPOC, artists of color, folks of the global majority, right? Like we're gonna focus intently on that. And I guess in both of your personal opinions, maybe, or through your foundations and through the endowments, this idea of supporting folks who have been doing the work, who are led by, run by, consist of folks who identify as artists of color, folks of the global majority, versus supporting institutions that are, predominantly white institutions that want to help artists of color. I believe there is value in both, but I am curious about how you navigate or negotiate where you think support should be going, or how you think about that, and this idea of moving forward. I think one of the things you said, Ben, on a previous conversation we had is like an ecosystem is important, and so supporting on all levels is helpful. And like we're in this particular moment where everyone's like, I have an idea, I have a program, they're coming from different places. Where do you see the importance of kind of the attention, the focus, the funding in terms of where it should go? I don't want you to speak on behalf of your panels, but you know what I mean? If that makes sense.
I would say I think our panels are at Hines. So many of the things that Ben mentioned, we did as well. We changed the operating support. We have Hines has a history of funding culturally specific work. They started in the 80s with what was called the Multicultural Arts Initiative. The program morphed into Advancing Black Arts in Pittsburgh, which I co-manage now with Celeste Smith at the Pittsburgh Foundation. We also, even within that program, did a zero decline rate, meaning before we rejected of 100 and so individual artist apps and some residency apps, we would probably fund 10% of them. So 90% of the people were being rejected. During the last 2 years, we gave everyone a $500 grant. We just took the money, allocated, and said, at least you're getting paid for the time you took to, apply. We don't have a lot of money in the portfolio. We are grateful to Mackenzie Scott, who just granted us $2 million in Advancing Black Art and supported that work. But the reality is there wasn't enough. How do we give grants to everyone during this time? What I want to say is I'm at the point now where it goes back to what Ben mentioned earlier about values funding. If you fund according to your values, I don't think there will be ultimately a need for this for funding individual groups of diversity. In Pittsburgh, because of the demographics, it becomes very black and white very quickly. And what I think is a disservice is that generally still, and still I know at our organization, 60% of our funding goes to operating support, which I love. But it generally goes to the largest institutions that are white-led. And so more than half the budget is already out the door before you start then dividing the pie for small, mid-sized organizations, culturally specific groups. And that's a fundamental problem. So the more and more you really focus on equity, you should not need to have these small pots. The problem is that if you don't intentionally do it at many foundations, it won't get done because people will still defer to the relationships they have. And is it more risky to fund a new BIPOC group that I don't know that's doing something that they call art, but I don't consider art, or easier for me to give this multi-million-dollar grant to the opera, the symphony, the group that we've been in relationship with for 100 years, right? And so I think that sometimes it's not about race, it's about relationship. I think many times it's about race and other things, which brings me back to where I started, which is this a question about how we're going to fund differently, or is this a question about how we're going to deal with the wealth and racial inequities in this country and how they play out in the way in which we fund? Because you can still be funding and doing well and have a history of it, as we do at the Heinz Endowments, and still, even with the virtue of what you're doing, still not be really getting at it at the level that you could be, because of other priorities, right? So that is, I think, something that we have to really fundamentally deal with. And another thing I want to mention before we go on is, like, again, there's always uncertainty in art making, right? So I think about the fact that we're saying now, like, oh, artists weren't sure where the money was going to come from. They had this. Many of our artists have more money now than they've ever had because they had to downsize. You know, some organizations that were doing 5 shows are now doing 3. And really, business-wise, it would have been a wise choice for them to be doing 3 all along, right? A season of 3 instead of a season of 5. So I say that because I remember being at Yale School of Drama and Ben Cameron, the first thing he's saying to us is, like, theater or art making is risky business, right? It's risk. And I think what happened was there's more transparency. Artists are more willing to talk to philanthropy about the real needs they're having. It's not that those needs did not exist before. It's just that now I can tell you, I'm having trouble paying my rent. I'm having trouble doing this, and I'm still expected to produce, right? And so that was a lot. I'm a little bit all over the place, but ultimately what I will say is I hope for the day where we don't have to segregate funding, that we are all in tune enough with our humanity to understand that there are multiple ways to define art, that we have to first begin in communities with people and then change the way in which we're funding to meet the need that we see. But for many, need is not a part of their strategy. And if need is not a part of your strategy, I doubt you're doing your work equitably anyway.
Boy, that just opened a huge can of worms. I want to get back to that need discussion. Yeah, because that's one I really think about a lot, especially because we do fund individual artists. And whereas I can sort of assess need on an organizational budget sheet, you know, I can see who's got a deficit and who doesn't. And, you know, when it comes to an individual, without looking at their tax returns, knowing who's got student loans and who doesn't, and who's got a spouse or a partner that's putting them on their health insurance and who doesn't, and who's maxed out their credit cards and who hasn't. And you know what I mean? It just gets so, the need thing that's a big thing that I would love to unpack. And so, you know, you and I will hang out sometime and we'll try to get to that, because I think that's a real issue and a real question. To your original question, I would just say, I think right now, many funders are being asked to make a strategic choice that informs what your question was. On the one hand, there is an historic inequity in the funding of artists and organizations that if we're going to create a more equitable landscape, requires us to bring organizations and artists that have historically been ignored up to scale or up to a different level. And those initiatives are going to primarily, indeed as Ford I think is doing around their cultural treasures as an example, are consciously saying, the groups that have been shut out are BIPOC organizations, and we need to bring them to a more level playing field. And that's going to have a very particular focus. I think the corollary question is, are we looking to rectify the past inequity, or are we looking to, not that these things are necessarily mutually exclusive, is the primary purpose of our funding to create a different structure or a different, I don't even know what the word I want is, template, a different architecture for how arts and culture will engage and interrelate and perform in the future. And it's about calling into being a kind of template and structure for collaboration and decision making that doesn't look like the ones in the past necessarily. And I think if that's where your attention is, it just invites very different questions about how you think about race and sexual orientation and disabilities and in creating a different kind of architecture for that future that just has a different implication. I will say that we've never gone into a panel and said we have racial quotas. We have never had a race-specific initiative. But I mean, it's clearly, I mean, this is the obvious. Who gets to decide has a radical impact on who the supported ultimately are. And if you go into a group like we do and say, our hope is that at the end of the day, you will come out with a roster of artists or organizations that you feel are emblematic of the greatest strengths in your community and the diversity within your community. And again, with our diversity of race and sexual orientation. And if you all come out at the other end and every group, I'll use jazz musicians for the end. If you come out at the end and say, every musician grant we're going to give is to a single jazz pianist, if that's what you really believe, we will go there because that is you. But we would just ask you to reflect. If we're trying to support the full diversity of the community, have we been insensitive to others and other points of view that we've come out at the other end with this homogenous thing? So again, we'll follow the panel lead, but we use that as a point of reflection. And so the stats that I shared with you at the beginning were not because we structured them. It's because when you assume community panels coming together, you get that vibrancy of different community cultures inherently as the result of what's most important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this idea of who's in the room to either make a recommendation or they're making the decisions highly influences, which I think goes back to your idea, your thoughts around power, Shonda, which is like, who are you in conversation with? Who are you in community with? Who are helping to make the decisions? Who's reviewing all of these things, right? And the more representative it is of the community that you're hoping to serve, the better chance it is that you will actually be able to do that, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm willing, go ahead. Oh, no, I was just going to say, like, any opportunity to spend time with you, Ben, I welcome. But I think the conversation around need is as complicated around what we call art is as complicated around the relationships that have existed for years. Meaning, I think that need comes up all the time. When foundations are in relationship with organizations over many, many years, there are people that I know, at least in Pittsburgh, maybe because it's smaller, who've known each other for 40, 50 years. Right? So I don't necessarily know your individual need as an individual artist because you gave me your taxes, but we're in relationship. So I may know you got COVID, and then I'm going to give you a little more leniency on your application. And I may know that your father died, and so now I'm going to extend that for you. My point is that those kind of things that happen in relationship that continue to uphold a power dynamic, and it leaves those who are in philanthropy with the ability to make decisions about certain things that perhaps need to become policy in the way that we manage artists, organizations in general, right? And for certain, I think that it begins with the relationships that we have to have. But if you don't have relationships with other people outside of your parameters, one thing that we're working on at Hines that I think is broadening our geographic reach. But the reality is that we know with broadening the geographic reach, we have less funds, right? So right now, 90% of our funds are in Pittsburgh, Allegheny County. That's who we're in relationship with. With the forward work that we're doing in phase 2, I'm saying, I don't want to talk to anybody I know. Anybody that we already know, I don't even think they should be allowed to come to the table. because there's so much need in the rural counties, and 90% of our funding is already in Allegheny, that if I'm sitting at a table with people I know for a fact I'm not broadening the scope of what we do. So I think that it takes some kind of, really, to your point, setting up new procedures and ways of being. It doesn't have to be quota based, but it definitely needs to be that people are represented in various ways and from different perspectives, and that includes not just race, not just disability, but also you think art is Ibsen and I think art is this. You think art is this visual artist, and I think art is a community experience where we're sharing food in the middle of, right? And all those conversations also still need to be had, I think, in philanthropy, because there's still a lot of elitist thoughts around what it is. And again, I'm speaking really broadly around what I'm seeing in the field in general, but I've experienced it in my short time in philanthropy as well. So the power dynamics, Danny, yes, I think they have to change. You have to and not only have the people at the table, but empower them to make decisions, as Ben mentioned, and trust that their decision is better than the one you would have come to on your own.
Well, and if I can just tag onto that to say, and our procedure is basically, we stand behind whatever the panels recommend for us. We have an open call process where we basically say, I mean, it's interesting you talk about people you've known for 30 or 50 years. One of the delight for us always is, because by definition, we only deal with artists at early points in their careers. We know every round we're going to discover people we've never heard of before. And that's part of the great thing about it. And we know when we've known you for 10 years, you've been around too long for us to continue to be of help to you. You need to have figured it out by then. So we're always at that churning sort of place. But our contract with the panel is, the board's job is to ensure that the process has had integrity and that indeed the artist recommended fit our criteria. Meaning, if, for example, the panel recommended somebody and the board said, I know for a fact that person, and I can substantiate it, I know this person has moved to Los Angeles and they no longer live in Minnesota or New York, it's the board's job to say, I'm sorry, even though the panel did it, we can't, because they're outside of our purview now. And the panels have identified alternates that automatically slot in. But the board's job is not to say, we like that artist better, so we're going to sub. We always go with what the panel said. And in constructing the panel, part of our job is to make sure that we have a wide range of viewpoints about what is art. In terms of racial construction, we always say no one racial group can have even half of the panel makeup. And so there's a plurality of racial and cultural groups in the decision-making process. We have a gender balance. So we're making sure that in the construction of the panel, we have a really fertile point of cross views. And one of the great things for all of our panels is how they at the end say, oh my God, I feel like as a panelist, I learned so much in this panel from other people on the panel about how to look at the world differently. And we always say to the panelists, you're going to come out at the end, which is always true. You're going to come out at the end of your deliberation saying 60% of what we just funded, I am like, yee-haw, wahoo, that is the best thing we've ever done. 20% you're going to say like, I'm there. I wouldn't necessarily have been my choice, but I totally get why we were supporting them. And 20% where I'm going to go, what the hell did we just do? Either because we funded somebody that I thought was off the wall or somebody I thought was a slam dunk got left in the cold. But that's the strength of a collaborative, diverse decision-making process. And so we don't necessarily expect you to love everyone on the list, but we hope you love the list. And inevitably the panels do. And that's just the great thing about this process that I love so much.
Yeah. That's really great. And I think, one of the things that's going through my mind right now is it's clear that a lot of change, there are practices that were put in place pre-COVID. There are a lot of changes and adjustments that were made in the time of COVID that we are still in. And it sounds like it's required it's about relationships, but it's also about some sort of like flexibility, some more transparency, some more what the need is. And I'm also thinking about kind of the changes that were made immediately that were needed, but also this idea of how is it this beyond the new normal? How is it sustainable? What does sustainability look like of these things, right? Because some of the things I'm hearing I'm like, oh, that's great that you're like, what do you need? Okay, great. What do you need? Okay, great. And then at some point, I guess like someone has to write that down and be like, here's what we fund, here's what we don't fund, here's literally how we do it, right? There has to be some sort of system and structures in place as well. So I'm just curious if you can talk, if either of you can talk a little bit about like, you know, adjustments and changes you've made and being more flexible and things like that. And this idea that you said at the top, Ben, about like, we're living in a world of disruption, constant disruption, right? The only thing that is constant is change, right? And so how can you make that sustainable, right? Like, can you make 5-year, 10-year plans on how to make this sustainable, or do you have to now make them 6-month, 1 year, you know, plans? I'm curious about that.
Can I just comment that? Oh, go ahead, please.
No, Ben, go ahead.
Well, I'm just going to push back slightly on the use of the word sustainable, because I don't believe in sustainability. You know,
okay.
I'm going to be real candid to say, I especially think there's going to be, and I've already seen it, a lot of super exciting work done by artists for whom being an artist is a chapter in a richer life, and they're going to move on. And that's not money badly spent. I'm going to see organizations that have a vital, urgent social need and may not need to be around in 10 years. I mean, I think when you think about who are the great nonprofits of the last 20 years, you ask me, I'm going to put ACT UP right on the front of the list. They existed to get AIDS on the agenda, and they got it. And then, okay, so great, it works over. Was that support badly done? No. So we're really conscious. What we're trying to recognize is curiosity, sensitivity to the larger environment, the ability to adapt and be nimble, and the assurance that there's enough of a capacity there to get the work done that they're asking our help to do. But that's not saying I need a 10-year plan because I need you to be around in 10 years. And again, that's us just being, that's us about what we care about. You know, I also think that for us, there's a fork in the road for funders. Is your goal to support success and projects, or is it to support learning? We incline to the latter. Is our work to essentially help organizations to change, or do we want to support the organizations that are already living the change in the world we hope to see, give them as much money as we can and get out of their way? Again, we subscribe to the latter. And the philanthropic landscape is so diverse. I think it needs both in all of those questions, but we're just not inclined to the sustainability side of the argument because we find a different value on the other side. So that's just in terms of how the question's being set up, I wanted to acknowledge. Shonda, I'm sorry I interrupted you.
Please do not apologize. I'm glad that you said it first. And I think I'm just coming behind to affirm that, one, money does not equate to sustainability. We recently did a study with some of the larger institutions that have received funding repeatedly, operating support, right? And it did not make their organizations more stable 50 years, 80 years later. Some of them still have structural deficits. Some of them still, again, are producing beyond what might be wise if you ask a business person, right? But you can't ever tell an artistic director that. So it's like, there are all these different complexities. And I think at Hines, part of the complexity of our work is that we are one of the largest funders of art and culture in the region. There are not many other organizations providing general operating support. Some groups do it, but they want it to be tied to economic development. Some groups do. So Hines is like purely, we want to just give you operating support. We want to support artists and organizations. So when you have been that for so long in an ecosystem, it is difficult then to make decisions about how to shift the funding to a more stringent set of values and priorities, because part of what has happened is you've become the person, the organization that is the catch-all. You are the one we can go to when we can't get the money from anyone else, because we know you'll value the production of art in general, right? And so there's a big challenge around spraying a lot wide or becoming more centered along a certain level of priorities. And that is a conversation you have whether you are an organization focused on equity and just or not, focused on justice, or if you are not necessarily focused. I think everyone has to determine, are we going to do a lot or are we going to be really focused in the way in which we direct funds?
Mhm.
One of the things I want to say is that part of the danger is this patriarchal relationship with philanthropy and this God complex. Like, first of all, we know for a fact, if we look at BIPOC organizations, that just because you don't give money doesn't mean they won't exist. There are some organizations that I have found through this forward work that we're doing for the Cultural Treasures that have been in existence 40 years. One of the oldest Black collectives of women visual artists in the nation began in Pittsburgh, 40 years old. Their budget is $38,000 to $50,000 a year. There is no way that a collective of women should be earning that at 40 years in. This grant that we recently gave them of $150, I wish it could have been $3 million. They were in tears. They were like, this is the best thing that has ever happened, right? So just, I'm trying to give perspective to like, but general operating for one large institution in Pittsburgh sometimes can be $1 million a year. So there is really a need to, one, realize this notion of beyond just trying to keep things going, what is it that we're trying to do? Are we trying to be just and restorative in our practices? Are we trying to make sure that, you know, we focus on developing the next best violinist? Because if that we're doing that, then that's a different level of investment. And I think it's just complex at a place like the Heinz Endowments, where we are the leading funder in the region, particularly when we know that we could be a part of the demise of an organization if we were to pull our funding and shift it in another priority, right? And I just think it's a dangerous place that, in general, in philanthropy, we need to look at, not only about funding, but when your organization is powerful enough to shift policy in a city and all these different things, I think we all should be paying attention to what the priorities are and how it's working, right?
Now, this is so interesting. You probably do too. We have a thing called exit grants. So when we schedule the fact that we think we're going to change our funding, we basically say to people, we're going to give you one more grant equal to the size of your most recent grant, and you can use it over 1 year or 2 years because we do multi-year grants. You can come back, but we need you to recognize this is probably the last time we anticipate this relationship for a while. So we help we try to land that a little differently. It's a really, and when I was at Duke, we had a program for national service organizations, and I kept saying to them, I don't think this is going to last, I as your program officer. And so I'm structuring this. I'm just basically saying you need to put aside 25% of your grant in reserves. So even though it's an annual reserve, I want you to sock 25% of it in a capital reserve or something else, because this money's not going to be there and it may disappear overnight. And if you're stocking it up, you're not going to go off the cliff. My worry here, we're a fraction of your size. You said you give away 70 million a year. We give away 4, and that's between New York and Minnesota combined. So that's in every discipline. So you start to cut it and you see how small we are. But we are behind the state and behind the McKnight Foundation now in Minnesota, the third largest funder of artists in Minnesota. And I think it's worth saying, in the context of this group, if you've read Giving USA, arts funding is going through a very difficult period. In the last year, and looking at what people gave money to, and maybe this has already been talked about in the conference, I haven't been there, I apologize. Giving USA, which analyzes all giving in the United States, except for government giving, including individual and foundations, divides the charitable world into 10 sectors. 8 of the 10 experienced growth in 2020. The 2 that saw declines were health, which really surprised me, which dropped 3.5%, and the arts, which dropped more than 7.5% in 2020. Wow. And if Mellon and Ford and Duke hadn't come forward with hundreds of millions for the arts, specifically in that year, it wouldn't have been 7.5%. It would have been far worse. So I just think part of what we need to couch this whole conversation in is a context that formal arts philanthropy is constricting. And there's a whole different conversation we need to have about what that implies and how we reanimate that or think about it for the future.
Absolutely. And I don't think, Ben, to your point, that conversation, sometimes we get caught in a conversation about general operating or project support.
Yes.
2 more questions on the grant or 5 questions. I think it's not about the number of questions. It's the questions that are being asked. I think it's not about project or operating or this. I think people want all of those things. It's a matter of a larger question that Ben is getting to, and that I think we have to answer in general in philanthropic organizations. And so I think with that clarity, though, I value no matter what size you are working with, you could be so effective when you have really clear prioritization around what you're going to do with that money. And so I just think there's some larger questions. There's a part 2 to this panel.
Well, and I think part of what we've learned is just we need to just be imaginative about how we're sensitive to people's time and effort. You know, as I said, we fund artists. We do fellowships, which are 2-year fellowships for artists, and they're essentially they're as close to a gen op as you can get for an individual. I mean, it's not quite for a lot of reasons. But we started to say, how much time are people spending on these applications? And we know we're going to get 1,500, 2,000 applications. We're going to give 60. So part of what we made the conscious decision to do was we've reduced the application to 4 questions, which we hope will have value for an artist no matter what. So one is basically, why do you make your work, or what are you trying to do? One is sort of, where do you see yourself in the community legacy? The third question is, when you look at your own work, where do you say, this is where I'm really strong and this is where I need to pay some more attention? So we want to see the work through your lens. And the fourth question we say is, if somebody gave you some money, what are the questions you'd be trying to figure out? We do not ask for a budget. We do not ask for a project. We do not ask for those things at that stage. We have to have them because of the IRS. So what we do now is, based on those 4 questions, the panel says, these are the artists we want to invest most in. We go to those 60 artists and say, you're lined up. Now we need to know how you're going to spend the money. So now we do need a budget from you. And now we do need a plan from you because the IRS requires that. But we didn't ask that of the other 1,600 artists that we turned down and took up days of their time to construct things that, and it's probably good for them to know their budgets anyway. So I don't mean to imply that. But how are we thinking about the structure in a way that's respectful of the time and energy and effort of the people that are being forthright enough to knock on the door, you know? So
and I hear you also, Ben. I also hear you honoring the fact that my ability to manage a budget does not directly correlate to my ability to create a great piece of art. Like, it just is not the same thing. And so when you have panels measuring things that don't necessarily have to do with what you're asking from an artist, you know, there's a problem with that as well. And it doesn't. Sometimes we talk about this thing around feasibility, but artists are going to create. They're going to make work. They're going to do what they do. And so at the end of the day, you know, can we measure whether you're going to get to completion or that? I mean, one, should that be the goal? Because isn't all of it a process towards building them? But then even if it is that they have to produce something at the end, what are you asking them to measure that? And so I mentioned earlier a study, and I see Sam. I just want to thank TDC because they've helped Hines a lot with getting to some of the facts that we know about our portfolio, and have been a great help in helping us to drill down and figure out what our priorities are recently.
Well, and to your point about should we get to production, I mean, part of what, when we listen to artists about what they need, a lot of what we heard is, yeah, it's great to have a project grant, but who's paying for the research before I even know what the project is? Who's paying for the time I spend in the library? Who's paying for me to travel and learn from other people? Who's paying for training? Who's paying for all those other costs outside of? And what if I propose a project and get in the rehearsal hall and realize this is the worst idea since sliced bread? Do I still have to go forward with it? And so we basically now say to our artists, you have to be able to tie all of your money either to creating a new work or developing your artistic skills or advancing your career. And however you divide that up, and whatever that means to you, we're going to stand behind. But because of who we are, if you want to buy your mother a new car because she's meant a lot to you, we just can't let you use our money for that unless you're doing a performance art piece in which your mother is receiving the car, and so it's a prop or something. I mean, you know, but you know, it's ultimately, how do you trust the artist respectfully to use the money in the maximum way according to what they need and can advantage in this moment? You know, so it's just a different point of view.
Great. Yeah. That's really great. And again, I'm cognizant of time. We've only got a minute left, and I think we could again, part 2, part 3, part 4, there's a lot to unpack here. I think we really just scratched the surface, but I think that the last thing I'd just like to ask before we leave this panel is, you know, is there a piece of advice, something, if you were like speaking to a group of philanthropists right now, which I believe some folks on this Zoom are, is there a suggestion? Is there something you'd ask them to consider, to think about as they like take the next step forward in their work?
I'm going to go really personal, because I think the best program officers remember who they were before they ever entered philanthropy. I remember being an artist and not being able to feed myself. I remember, having to sleep on people's couches when I lived in Los Angeles. So what I think that makes us the best in what we do is to remember the humanity that is behind anyone trying to accomplish anything in this world. And if we approach the processes in that way, we won't approach from a place of privilege and high demand. We will approach from a place of empathy and trying to understand what they need most, and trusting that they know what that is, and it will lead to the ultimate outcome that they've said they want to reach. And so that's my hope, that we would all just continue to remember our humanity, remember what it was when we weren't earning as much as we are now in philanthropy, and what struggle looked like that helped to forge us into the people that we are today, sitting on this, in this Zoom for this conference.
Thanks, Shonda. Ben?
Wow, that's so. Now I want to have conversations 3, 4, 5, and 6.
I know.
Exactly what you just said made me think of so many things. I guess I would say probably. I'll just confess there are two. There's something that I find myself thinking about a lot right now. We're working with a fantastic woman named Juanita Mosby Tyler, who runs a thing called the Equity Project out of Denver, and she's really said to us, when you're in a moment of trying to be thoughtful about responding to a problem, it's important to resist the impulse to instrumentalize a solution right away. And so she's really saying to us, when you see a problem, the next step is not what are we going to do to fix it. The next step is, what are the things we need to be more attentive to first in order to come up with the appropriate the appropriate solution or the appropriate strategy. And that issue, especially in a world of the new normal that I said before about faster, is I think part of our job in the arts is to redefine the time signature and to promote deeper listening and thoughtfulness and reflection. And I think we need to model that in our work and in the way we deal with each other, in a way that invites us to bake that in more deeply to the work that maybe we have in the past. So I just champion that a little bit.
Wonderful.
And to thank you for having us. Yep.
Yeah, thank you both.
Danny, for asking.
Of course, thank you both so much. Thank you to everyone who joined us. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And again, you can join the informal chat after this. I think it's in the chat somewhere. But thank you all, and thank you.